Shigeru Mizuki was an artist most well known for his comics about yokai and the Gegege no Kitaro series of comics, writing and drawing stories about fantastical topics. However, on a few notable occasions, he would produce nonfiction works, all of which were autobiographical in nature. In the late 1980s, Mizuki published Kamiku Showashi, a nonfiction comic that had a twofold purpose: half chronicle of the Showa period of Japanese history lasting from 1926 until 1989, and half autobiography, detailing his life throughout the period. In the mid 2010s, these were translated into English by Zach Davison and published in 4 volumes titled Showa, A History of Japan, and further subtitled with the span of years each volume covers. Thanks to these translations, the English-speaking world has a very detailed account of what his life was like, from his young days to the publishing of his most famous works to the end of the Showa era. March 8th, 1922. Shigeru Mura is born in the city of Sakai Minato, Tottori Prefecture, in the Chugoku region of the western coast of Honshu. He was the middle of 3 boys, 2 years apart from each other. One of the first details about his younger self that he would relay was his voracious appetite, along with his propensity to test the edibility of various objects. If he could fit it into his mouth, he would taste it. His desire for food will be a recurring theme in his life, whether it be for want of it due to a severe lack of it, spurred on by personal financial difficulty, economic turmoil, or the chronic logistical failures of the army he was conscripted into. Tasting a variety of unappetizing edibles, and in some cases inedibles, will be just as common a theme. His appetite would not solely be orientated around food, however. His father had amassed a fairly sizable collection of volumes on film and theater, of which young Shigeru would spend hours looking through, even prior to becoming literate, just enjoying the photographs or illustrations contained within. His introduction to and subsequent fascination with yokai began at the age of 5, when an elderly woman by the name of Kageyama Fusa, who he referred to as Nononba, who acted as a sort of grandmother figure in his life, and introduced him to the concept of yokai and other spiritual concepts. The first time he visited her, walking along the mountainside trails that led to her village, numerous shrines and natural sights had a certain beauty to Shigeru when he saw them for the first time in his life. When he did arrive into her village, she would speak of an enormous variety of yokai, how they came to be, what they sought to do, and how to recognize them. He developed an immense lifelong interest into concepts relating to spirituality, always curious about the world's religions, what happens to a human after death. Cemeteries and shrines would prove to be some of the most relaxing locations for him. In graveyards, he would often speak to the spirits of those long dead, entombed beneath the ground. He would imagine worlds beneath those headstones and the spirits calling out to him to tell their stories. Meanwhile, back amongst the immediate Mura household members, the father would be fired from his job at a local bank after leaving early one night, due to his fear of being alone in the dark with the threat of robbery looming overhead. He didn't stay unemployed for long. He bought an old building and a projector and opened a theater. The business proved very successful, only being halted by the theft of the projector one night. In search of work, he made his way to Osaka and would send money home whenever he could, and would even return home periodically. Even with his efforts, his family still worried immensely. He remained persistent. Shigeru would describe him as optimistic to a fault, perhaps compensating for his lack of courage. He did also state that he was an abject coward. Outside the classroom, Shigeru was constantly getting into fights, almost every day after dismissal. This was not helped by his induction into the local gang of his neighborhood. The older kids at school were its leaders, and its primary leader referred to as the Boy General. The gang was composed of kids primarily from Esaki, with their rivals being from Hanamachi, both of these neighborhoods in Sakai Minato. They would see constant engagements either involving hand-to-hand fighting or even stone throwing. The latter form of fighting occasionally led to fairly serious injuries. One particular day, his gang sent him to spy on the rival gang. After positioning himself, he was discovered and captured. The Hanamachi boys had recently caught a toad and roasted it. They tried to force Shigeru to eat it, but he refused. Frustrated, they decided it wasn't appetizing enough and covered it in human feces. Without any visible options, Shigeru ingested the toad, seasoning and all. One day after this incident, Isaki had been preparing for an attack by the combined forces of the Hanamachi gang, and another one they had combined forces with. Isaki's base, an old wooden building, was to be the staging ground for this fight. During the fighting, they managed to ward off the bulk of the enemy forces, but their two leaders marched in through the entryway despite the retreat of their soldiers. The defenders had thrown a bucket full of rocks over a support beam on the ceiling hanging over the entrance, which they dropped on the two leaders. They captured the two and roughed them up. Shigeru took the opportunity to have his younger brother defecate, and then wielding a bamboo rod, forced the excrement into the mouth of the Hanamachi leader. Shigeru would continue practicing the arts, playing out grand operas before his parents involving a homemade string instrument, along with fight scenes and very vivid depictions of character deaths with every character played by little Shigeru. He also began to paint. After being gifted an oil painting set, he began to spend a great deal of time doing so. He would describe the activity as his favorite, and would often tune out the rest of the world and his other responsibilities. While his academic performance always remained sour, his artistic skill was good. Even his teachers noticed, and so good they thought it, that one even organized an exhibition to showcase his art to the public. It would also be in his time in either elementary or middle school that he wrote his first published work. On 22nd February 1932, Japanese military forces were engaged in combat with the Chinese 19th Root Army. 3 soldiers from the Japanese 18th Engineer Battalion filled a large bamboo rod with explosives and tied a fuse to one end and rushed towards the Chinese positions, attempting to destroy obstacles they had erected. The fuse, however, was cut too short, and all 3 of them were caught in the blast. Back in Japan, they were celebrated as heroes who volunteered for this action without regard for their own lives, and even had a statue erected to them in Tokyo. In reality, they were ordered to perform this maneuver by their CO and had not expected to be killed by their own equipment. Shigeru would write an essay about this event and even mailed it to the commander of the 27th Cavalry Regiment, and the essay was ultimately published in Shonen Club magazine. Although I have yet to dig up the records validating this, if this story is true, then chronologically it would be his first ever published work. He would eventually graduate from middle school, and soon after, his father got him an apprenticeship working for a plate maker in Osaka. While there, he would finally be fitted with a pair of glasses. It wouldn't help much as he was still very clumsy and careless and was soon fired. His dad helped him find work with another plate maker and even helped him find an apartment. However, he would also be fired from this job after losing a zinc plate. He would spend about 3 months doing little more than painting. Then his parents sent him to Seika Art School. Although his infrequent attendance, often choosing to spend his time organizing his insect collections and drawing comics, led him to either dropping out or getting kicked out. He then attempted to apply to a horticultural school to earn enough units to transfer to Ueno Art School. The school was accepting 50 new students, and there were only 51 applicants. During the interviews with the faculty, Shigeru recalled making the following statement. After graduating, I will serve the people of my country by making art. He regarded this as a rather embarrassing statement, which, considering it does seem more reminiscent of something a fictional shonen character would say, is a fair enough statement. The faculty weren't happy either, as they were displeased that this prospective student had little interest in horticulture and was only using the school as a bridge to another. In the end, of the 51 applicants, he was the only one who was rejected. While Shigeru's dad searched for work abroad in Indonesia, Shigeru looked for work at home. The rest of the country had a new figure step on stage, a man whose actions would have dire consequences for the Japanese nation as well as the geopolitical realities of the world at large. Hideki Tojo. The first volume of Showa, A History of Japan, ends with this quote describing the previously mentioned. Tojo is a man who never smiles, and because of this, he takes away the smiles of the Japanese people. He loves slogans like, "A man who doesn't want is a man who wins," and "luxury is the enemy." His time in command is a siege on the Japanese nation. We would soon learn what it meant to truly suffer. Shigeru found work running a paper route and attended a trade school for a brief period. His clumsiness once again got him fired, and his carelessness got him expelled, both of these occurring on the same day. There are other sections of the series where he offers a more personal and emotionally insightful reflection upon what he thought of this time period. Also incorporates some other sections featured beyond the scope of what's incorporated within the 1939 to 1944 volume of this series. While he did say his childhood was the happiest time in his life, once he grew to adulthood, there was only a long road of suffering ahead of him that was only broken when he was already an aged man. Perhaps only interrupted by a brief period that ironically came in the jungles of the South Pacific. That's a story for later, though. For most people, their only joy would be access to even a small amount of food. For those conscripted into the military, there was no future to look forward to. Shigeru would go on to say that he hated the army and the system he was born into. He finds it strange that people took pride in their tools of death and destruction. Describing draft notices as death sentences when he later received his own, he thought that it would be the end of the line for him. When the people of his village saw him off to the train, every shout of banzai he heard felt like a gut punch, he said. Again, he brings up that aspect of how not only did the actions of the Japanese government cause immense suffering upon those throughout Asia, but so too did they cause great suffering to the Japanese themselves. Shigeru found himself delivering papers again, while his brother received his draft notice and became a Navy preparatory candidate, essentially entering into the Japanese equivalent of Navy Officer Candidate School. He would be deployed as a naval officer. While Shigeru remained at home, he did find time to attend movie theaters, doing so as often as possible, whilst otherwise sleeping and eating. Shigeru began attending night school in Osaka, although his education would be interrupted by the incorporation of military drills and the replacing of faculty with retired army officers. Prior to receiving his conscription notice, he began to reading many works on religion and philosophy. Anticipating his death within the next few years, he wanted to find meaning in life or his death. Finding few answers no matter how many times he reread the Bible, Buddhist texts, nor did works by Seneca or Goethe seem to help either. The day would come that he got his draft notice. Colored red as a gesture of good luck for the recipient, the entire town came out to see him off, and his 1,000-stitch belt off on the train that took him off to the Totori countryside for training. Shouts of banzai from the crowd, evaporating what remnant of hope he still had left. His initiation into the army was rough. He would get beaten nearly every day, whether by a commissioned or non-commissioned officer, not helped by the fact that he wasn't a very good soldier. His ill-disciplined approach to life didn't change even in an organization as discipline and conformity-centered as the Imperial Japanese Army. He had the worst-maintained equipment in the entire unit. There were several instances of him either being late for roll call or curfew, and he never seemed to treat any of these incidents with any degree of seriousness either. There were some good moments. His squad leader, who usually delivered the beatings, tired of dealing with Shigeru's incompetence, actually began to clean his rifle for him. One day they were issued canned pineapples. They hadn't had any sweet fruit for some time, and Shigeru was overjoyed with this opportunity. Sneaking off to the laundry room, he forced open the can's lid with his thumb. It would be the greatest thing he had ever tasted, up to that point anyways. He did actually find the military's food to be pretty good, his ever-present appetite actually causing him to gain weight, which he could achieve with a limited mealtime by eating very quickly and then getting a second serving. His incompetence and apathy would get him transferred to the Bugle Corps, which would, for most people, have been a blessing, may have been for Shigeru, but his inability to play the instrument properly would cause him to develop a great resentment towards the branch and instrument. He was told to speak with the Master Sergeant to request a transfer if he desired, and so desired he did, and submitted a transfer request. The Master Sergeant was incredibly surprised, more so than Shigeru had ever seen anyone. He had to submit the request 3 times. The sergeant was trying to keep Shigeru in the Bugle Corps to keep him safe, for whatever reason. Even though the Bugle Corps was difficult for Shigeru, it would most likely guarantee a safe posting in Japan, ensuring that he be kept off the line. from either China or the Pacific. The same night that his transfer request went through, soldiers were called to report to the front, Shigeru included. He was assigned to the 229th Infantry Regiment of the 38th Infantry Division, although again, the way unit types are translated isn't always perfect and may be slightly inaccurate. Before departure, the men got to visit their families one last time, for many, the last time ever. His mom made his favorite foods, and Shigeru's family threw a farewell party the next day. Taking a walk to go see the old sites, his old elementary school, the old temple, an old field, eventually making his way back to the party. Later, his parents saw him off on the train, and he was back to join his unit. He was late again, whatever the case. They all boarded a boat and headed for the South Pacific. New recruits were forced to set up inside a cabin beside the boiler room, making it incredibly hot, and were kept there most of the time by the veterans. They landed on Palau and immediately marched to Ngatpang, building a camp there. Several men collapsed from exhaustion, their first casualties in the field. On Palau, they were far behind the action, and although life there was fairly relaxed, Shigeru's ever-present status as the company punching bag remained alive and well. The only rations they were issued were dried vegetables, and because of this, he and a group of soldiers he'd made friends with set out for the mountains to find snails that they intended to cook. Eventually doing so, they each ate one and found them to be rather tasty. Upon returning to camp, they were reprimanded for eating them. Their officers worried about disease spreading from the snails. Their time on Palau wouldn't last forever. The time came for them to ship out to the front lines. The transport vessels that picked them up were ships that had been in service during the Russo-Japanese War 40 years prior, and were so degraded that Shigeru broke off a piece of the guardrail of the ship that he had boarded, the Shinano Maru, with his bare hand. He and the other new recruits were back in the boiler room again. For rations, nothing more than carrots. The voyage was largely uneventful, with an occasional attack by a submarine, although no hits were scored on the vessel. They landed on New Britain while being strafed by American P-38 Lightnings, which were fought off by severely outnumbered Japanese aircraft. Eventually, they made landfall and set up camp in Kokopo, East New Britain. His initial thought after arriving on land was regarding how beautiful he thought the jungles of the island were, admitting that he never could have anticipated the horrors that awaited him. Life was more dangerous there, with Allied aircraft often performing strafing runs on the soldiers. The billets in Kokopo were rat-infested, making it near impossible for any sleep to be had. At least for Shigeru, who couldn't stand rats. They moved further inland to a town called Toma, where the abuse handed out by the officers and the hard labor exhausted them. He was almost surprised that the burden placed upon them by his own military didn't kill him first before any Allied soldiers had the chance to. Shortly following the Allied landings on New Britain, Shigeru's parents would read about it in the paper, and fearing his death to be imminent, which for most other soldiers on the island it was, his mother would give up eating octopus, one of her favorite foods, holding on to hope that this temporary sacrifice would help the kami listen to her prayers. The men waiting in Kokopo would be ordered to move out to Zungen Point, the southernmost tip in Henry Reed Bay. Before they did so, they were ordered to go to the comfort station. Shigeru in his writings doesn't delve into as much detail about where the woman came from, or whether or not these women were Japanese or otherwise. I'm not sure how well it was understood by the majority of Japanese soldiers during the post-war period that the large majority of these women were kidnapped and effectively slaves, as they never saw any compensation for their services, which of course they didn't have a choice in doing either. What is stated is that they evacuated on board a hospital ship, which was sunk right out of port by Allied submarines, lost with all hands. Whatever the case, Shigeru stated that he never actually went there and wandered into a native village. They began to communicate despite speaking two vastly different languages. This initial interaction would foreshadow a very important part of Shigeru's stay on this tropical island and a major component of his survival there. Back at base, he and his comrades wrote their farewell letters, not so much as a will as just a last message to whoever may have survived them back on the archipelago. They met their new CO and headed off for Zungen Point. By night they moved, as Japanese units nearly always did. They took a boat and landed on Zungen Point unopposed. They had expected to find the enemy waiting for them, but found no one. Back to more of the same. Hard work, building fortifications, getting beat by their superiors, and the hardships of the jungle. There was an impressive list of things trying to kill them. Allied forces, both ground and air-based, diseases like dengue fever and malaria, the local wildlife such as crocodiles. The aforementioned hard labor and abuse all turned the island of New Britain into a place of immeasurable suffering. Shigeru and a squad were sent out into the jungle to find a pig and borrowed a canoe from the natives and set out on a nearby river to do so. Somewhere along the river, the other soldier on board with him fell out without him noticing. Later, the squad would find the lower legs of a soldier floating down the river covered in mud. They couldn't be certain it was him, but it seemed the most likely answer. And most likely he had been eaten by an alligator. They ended up just asking naval personnel for a pig. Everyone got a piece of pork the size, roughly equivalent to a sugar cube. Later, the company commander ordered Shigeru into his office quarters, requesting him to draw Hanafuda cards and a portrait of himself. Over in Jacquinot Bay, a detachment of Navy personnel were stranded there, waiting for a ship to evacuate on. A 10-man squad was formed, Shigeru included, and set out for Jacquinot Bay. Loaded down with full kit, none of them expected to survive. They arrived in Bayenne and set up for the night. He was put on last watch for the night and just spent the time watching the jungle until the sun rose. All he could really think about was how beautiful the sights were. Upon reflection, he stated that he's ashamed to have been seeing the world in this light at this time, and he would go on to write this of himself. I knew nothing of life and death. I never took anything seriously, and maybe I never really did change that much. Perhaps these thoughts were because of what happened next. He made his way back to where his squad was sleeping and heard explosions. Panicking, Shigeru hurried away and tumbled off a cliff into deep water. He called out for help. And 3,000 miles away, his mother awoke. Shigeru climbed down onto a cliff face to avoid Allied soldiers passing by above. They had ignited flares and appeared to be combing the area for any survivors. Believing he had been spotted, he clung tightly to that cliffside until they passed by. All the while, his parents back in Sakai Minato were praying for his safe return. Eventually, he hauled himself up and over the cliff face, and exhausted, he fell asleep. After waking, he walked through the jungle until a native spotted him and asked where he had come from, to which Shigeru replied honestly. Then the native ran back, and Shigeru realized that he was scouting, and that he would soon return in force. He didn't know what they had in store for him. Who knows? Maybe it was harmless, but Shigeru didn't intend to test it. He dove into the sea and swam. Swimming for hours, he made his way along the shore. Not knowing where to go, as swimming back to base meant swimming into the habitat of the alligators, he just stayed in the ocean, hoping the natives would forget about him. Eventually, hopelessly exhausted after swimming for what must have been an entire day, he drifted ashore. He thought he would be safe. He couldn't see anyone ashore, and as such thought he'd be safe. Soon as he did wash up on shore, torches ignited. The natives were still waiting for him, and surrounding him were, by his estimation, 30 or so men. They grabbed hold of him, and despite being exhausted, he miraculously mustered enough energy to break free and dove back into the water, slicing his feet on sharp coral in the process. The blood from his wound made it even more difficult to hide, as it caused luminescent algae to crowd around his foot, illuminating his position. He swam back to the tree line, hoping to disappear into the jungle. Making it back to shore, he climbed up, and the first tree he encountered, by an incredible stroke of luck, had been hollowed out, creating a large hole for him to make his way through. Naked, wet, bleeding, exhausted, afraid, and having no idea where he was or where to go, he pressed forward. Eventually, he ran into something. Going around it proved impossible. Too wide. There appeared to be no way in which he could advance. So, with clouds of mosquitoes hovering around, he went to sleep. Come morning, he made a shocking discovery.
He was right beside a cliff face. Had that wall in the night been absent, he would have wandered right off it. Speaking of this wall, it was nowhere to be found. He credited this phantom barrier to be a narikabe, a yokai that stands in the way of humans for one reason or another. He followed the sound of a nearby river, and after spotting large shrimp inside, he decided to do some fishing. After some time and some effort, he was able to catch a single shrimp, and ate it right there. A little more energy to keep on moving. Recognizing the river as one that flowed by the base, he thought he could try floating down it until he reached his comrades, although the current proved to be too violent and too powerful for that to be an option. Walking would have to do. He found a village that appeared to have been recently abandoned, evidenced by warm ash. He slept again, and after waking found bananas as a welcome relief. Then he heard a disturbance in the jungle. He readied for a fight. Jumping out to confront the unknown sound approaching, he was relieved to see that it was Japanese Navy personnel. He told the officers that he was supposed to report to his commander. The officers then informed him that his squad has been wiped out. He was the only survivor. Then the officer chastised him for this.
Quite infamously, the Japanese military during the Pacific War had a prohibition against surrendering, and soldiers and sailors were expected never to retreat in the face of the enemy, but to sacrifice their lives in the discharge of their duties. Surrender or retreat was considered too great a shame for any Japanese serviceman to bear, and for many it would be, preferring to die fighting or take their deaths into their own hands. Surviving on engagement, where everyone else had fallen, was much thought of in the same way. If one survived, they must have failed to discharge their duty properly. For Shigeru, this meant accusations of desertion and cowardice. By the officers, anyways. Fortunately, he did find some respite in the enlisted men who were duly impressed by his story. Then he came down with malaria. Back in army hands, the beatings again resumed, and it was back to work. No sympathy for the sick. The commander requested his presence in his quarters, and much to Shigeru's surprise and relief, he only wanted to thank him for drawing over his faded Hanafuda cards and offered him some of his own rations. For all of the abuse and horror that the army subjected Shigeru to, every so often he would find some respite. The soldiers continued building their fortifications, and by night had to contend with the sighting of an enemy torpedo boat in harbor. The news kept the majority of the soldiers on edge, although Shigeru would be unfazed, sleeping through the sound of any explosion, which, unfortunately for him, may have contributed to developing a reputation of fearlessness. This would get him sent into the jungle alone to gather water for cooking. Here alone in the jungle, he would hear bird calls with none in sight and the falling of a phantom tree, a tengu fall. He actually didn't mind being alone, even going so far as to say he loved his time alone in the jungle. The soldiers still got mail delivered from home. Shigeru received a letter from his mother stating that if he died, so too would his parents die. It would be around this time that Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo and Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura would order the noble deaths of all soldiers. Soon, another squad would be formed and deployed to Mirai to wipe out Allied intelligence officers. While in patrol in heavy rain, Shigeru's squad would be strafed by an Allied aircraft, fatally wounding one man. They were about to fall back to safer positions, but the NCO ordered them to retrieve a finger from his body in order to use for his funeral. Hacking it off with an entrenching tool, the squad moved out. They encountered a detachment of Allied soldiers and engaged. The firefight lasted less than 5 minutes, with no casualties on either side, revealed by the lack of any bodies being discovered after they pursued the fleeing Aussies or Yanks. They did, however, find their encampment abandoned and filled with rations, the quantity and variety of which was available to Allied soldiers amazed the Japanese equivalents, especially in comparison to their own diet, which typically consisted of only a single bowl of rice each day, if they were lucky. Back at base, Shigeru's company received orders that they were to march off to Tsungen Point, a peninsula extending out from the northern shore of Henry Reed Bay in eastern New Britain. It was here that they received word that the Allies were being reinforced at Karori by an entire regiment, severely outnumbering the depleted units deployed to Tsungen, which were already suffering catastrophic supply shortages. A platoon marched off from Tsungen to investigate the reports. Many of the men had malaria and succumbed to illness along the way, their bodies unable to handle the stress forced upon them by the disease and the intense physical pain of marching in full kit through the jungle. Upon reaching Kaurori, the men were astonished at the number of men and material that the Allies could throw at them. Perhaps it was here, or perhaps it had long since been accepted that they would have little chance of winning this fight, and even less of a chance of surviving it. When the unit returned from Karori, the battalion commander, Major Naruse, chastised the men who survived the ordeal for not dying right there in Karori. He expected them to engage the enemy as soon as they could see them, no matter how hopeless the odds were. The commander of the platoon, First Lieutenant Kogawa, was even told by Major Naruse that he should have been shot after accusing him of cowardice. Major Naruse was hated by nearly everyone under his command. He believed that every soldier should die for their country. If they were ordered to, then should follow every order to the last, irregardless of how sensible or suicidal they were, and that every soldier should be proud to meet again at Yasukuni Shrine. Shigeru takes pains to point out that this type of attitude, very stereotypical of the Japanese during the war, was more commonly seen amongst the commissioned officers. Enlisted men didn't often care much for these values and valued self-preservation to a higher degree. Most only followed through with carrying out orders that led to their noble deaths because they were forced to by their officers. Shigeru was with a squad in a bunker who would order him to go fetch water for them. He was reluctant at first and of course had no way of knowing, but this action would save his life once again. He took up his squad's canteens and made his way to the river. After he returned, he found the aftermath. The squad had fired at advancing forces seemingly only to see their silhouettes. A tank rolled up and put a shell directly into the bunker. Not a single occupant survived. Shigeru had narrowly escaped death once again, and to add insult to injury, the advancing unit was Japanese. It was a friendly fire incident. While the rest of Shigeru's company did battle with the enemy, the officers discussed what the battalion's next course of action would be. Tsungen Detachment Commander Major Naruse believed that now would be the time for every man in the company to die their noble deaths. He ordered them to form up for a suicide charge against the Allied soldiers. However, there was one dissenting voice from this plan. The company commander, Second Lieutenant Kodama. He argued that they would be of much more use by fighting a protracted guerrilla campaign rather than carelessly expending their lives by charging straight into Australian and American rifles and machine guns. The company commander was permitted to lead roughly 60 men, Shigeru included, to fight this guerrilla war. The rest of the Tsungen detachment forms up. Major Naruse sends one final message to Japanese headquarters in Rabaul, informing the brass that they would charge the enemy. He then smashed the receiver. Onward they charged, toward their noble deaths. An official report was filed that every last man at Tsungen had met their end charging the enemy, unaware that roughly 6 men were retreating to Rabaul. Lieutenant Kodama had to be carried out of the bunker on a stretcher. They were surrounded by enemy forces. The plan was to make it to the Ramingi Road and then follow it all the way to Rabaul. The commander was so incapacitated with malaria that he had to be carried the whole way. Many more came down with malaria but didn't have the luxury of being carried by their comrades. Rain was pouring heavily on them for the duration of their retreat. Ultimately, the commander would order the men to set him down and leave him there. The men protested, stating that they could still carry him, imploring him to try to make it home. It didn't matter. He gave his final order. Think of me in April when the cherry blossoms bloom. The survivors marched on and through the jungle, heard a single shot ring out. After 3 days, and their numbers being depleted even further, they made it to Marunga. The garrison there sent a message to Rabaul reporting on their survival. Few were happy about their survival. The Marunga garrison was taking care of them, but the officers were furious that they didn't all die with the rest of the Tsungen garrison. The survivors were confused and frustrated at why their own country was so eager to send them to their deaths, why their own army was so eager to get them killed. The highest-ranking member of the Tsungen detachment, likely an NCO as nearly all the commissioned officers had been killed by then, was flown to Rabaul.
He did so to give a report to the command staff, but was greeted by a junior officer who made clear that the command staff didn't much care for a report. All they wanted was for each of them to die. The man shot himself at nightfall. The Zungan detachment would be resupplied and redeployed, their commanders trying their best to ensure they didn't survive. Shigeru was left at base, safe from marching out with the rest by the case of malaria he'd come down with. The soldiers were tasked with retaking Zungen, and along the way, even more died in the ensuing fighting. Before they could all be wiped out, they received orders that all available units were to report to Marunga. They made their way back to Marunga and then to Yanmar. In Yanmar, two of their few surviving officers were given their final orders. In order to atone for the dishonor they had brought upon themselves for their retreat from Zungen, they must give away their lives. The two show up for the ceremony late, smoke their last cigarette, and then their story ends. Shigeru was still incapacitated with malaria when shrapnel from an Allied bombing run hit his left arm. The physician wanted to perform a transfusion, to which another nearby soldier offered his blood, and then the doctor asked Shigeru for his blood type, to which he couldn't remember. Something important to remember here is that the majority of Japanese people are aware of their own blood type. Shigeru here can't recall what should be a very simple thing due to his disorientation at the immense pain and blood loss. Not wanting to risk a cross transfusion, the doctor wraps up his arm and leaves the rest to chance. By next morning, the arm is rotting, and the only course of action the doctor can think of is an amputation. The doctor is an optometrist by trade and has no experience in performing amputations, but goes through with it anyways. The operation is a success. Even so, Shigeru's prospects look grim. In immense pain and with all his hair gone, his appetite still remained. He ate any food available as he had done every other time he came down with malaria. His appetite was a constant no matter how dire the situation became or how poor his health. He did get some good news when the medical staff decided to have him evacuated to Rabaul. A transport vessel came. He and another soldier had to walk down to the beach to board. Every step required enormous effort. They made it aboard and shoved off into Allied torpedo boat infested waters. 2 days it took to reach the beach, and after landing they had to walk down to a road to get to Rabaul. They slept one more night on the road and then arrived later the following day. Immediately after making it into a field hospital, Shigeru fell asleep, barely able to handle anything more. Next morning he got familiarized with the layout of the hospital. It was an open-air complex but did have dugout tunnels serving as an air raid shelter. Those trying to sleep would be soaked by the rain during the night, as the thatched roof was not watertight. The hospital was short on resources, and there wasn't a great deal of food to go around. A medic suggested imploring the natives nearby the encampment for food. Perhaps they could trade some of their less essential supplies. Shigeru attempted to venture out, but a medic forced him back to his bed as enemy aircraft had been spotted above, and there was a prohibition against anyone being outside while this was the case. 3 more days without any more food than what little rations they had left. He tried again. Surviving a strafing run by an enemy aircraft, he collapsed from exhaustion and had to be dragged back to the shelter by a medic. 2 or 3 more days, then he tried again. With enormous effort in every step, he made it to a nearby native village. This encounter would have a great effect on the remainder of Shigeru's experiences during the war, and even his experiences afterwards. As soon as he laid eyes on the village, the war behind him vanished. It didn't exist. He wandered in and began to eat their food without any introduction. The men were initially angered by his actions, but a woman said something to them that put them at ease. Relations were friendly between Shigeru and the natives from here on out. He would give them the name the People of the Forest. In actuality, they were an ethnic group known as the Tolai. They had a copy of the Bible written in a Polynesian language, which was written using Latin characters, and from this day they gave Shigeru his new name, Paul, and so he began to refer to himself as Paul of the Forest. The three Tolai he interacted with most were an old woman named Ikarian, a younger woman named Epupe, and a young boy named Topetoro. With these new friends, he felt like after almost 4 years of constant pain and suffering, the threat of death perpetually looming overhead, that he could finally be at ease, at least temporarily. Paul offered them some cigarettes, and then they continued to eat. Eventually, he returned to the field hospital where he noticed a certain odor emitting from his arm, describing it as that of a newborn baby. One of the doctors said that his arm had completely healed. He finally found himself feeling something he had not felt in a very long time: hope. Hope that he could one day see home again. Even with this renewed hope, life was still challenging. The rain brought malaria with it, and Shigeru came down with it again. This time, it brought about something that had this time it brought about something that had never happened before. It caused his appetite to disappear. One night, after heavy rains had flooded nearby rivers and his sensibilities had left him, he got up and wandered out of the shelter and into a river which carried him downstream and left him somewhere inside of the jungle. Medics retrieved him hours later. Once again his fever began to dissipate, his appetite returned, and he wanted fruit. He crawled out to the front of the shelter and waited for some of the tolai to pass by and ask them to bring some fruit by. Ignoring the challenges of the other soldiers who thought him a fool for imploring the natives for help, the tolai returned with fruit for him. Slowly, he began to recover from his 10-day bout of malaria. Finally being dismissed from the hospital, as all patients who were well enough to work were required to assist in agricultural work, before resuming his duties, he went back to the village to thank its inhabitants for helping keep him alive. A medic warned him about the non-fraternization policy between natives and soldiers, which Shigeru diligently ignored. In the village, the Tolai said that they would even plant a field for him there. Returning back to base where the medic who had warned him earlier had him report to the office quarters, where he tied him to a post and then chastised him for disobeying orders. The following night, completely undeterred by the officer's attempts to keep him away from his friends, he went to go see them again. The villagers had tilled a field for him and said that they would even put on a dance in the near future, the Shinshin. Skipping back to base, he came across a cadre of officers walking down the road. He saluted them and was saluted back. He later found out that at the head of the group was Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commander of the 16th Army. For all of Imamura's talk of noble deaths, he was beloved by the troops, holding a reputation for being a very empathetic individual. Sometime later, it was time for the Shinshin. There, he was provided an imposing chair to sit in and observe the dance. Afterwards, he had dinner at Apupe's parents' house. The Tolai had begun to consider him part of their community, and even sitting to them, the Tolai had begun to consider him part of their community, even stating that to them, he was not Japanese, he was Tolai. Sometime between then and the last time he had seen them, a certain document was signed aboard the USS Missouri, and roughly a month before then, the Emperor, Hirohito, had addressed the nation for the first time. Speaking in classical Japanese and using very vague and nonspecific language, he informed the nation that it could endure no more. Japan surrendered. Just rumors to the soldiers in the South Pacific, they were confirmed by General Imamura personally. The war was over. The struggle, however, was not. They did get some more food, but still had to work. They would be there for 3 more months before the evacuation began. Another strain of malaria, black water fever, would tear through the ranks. Many die after urinating blood. After surviving a war this long and brutal, when the time did come to load up their supplies and prepare to leave the island, Shigeru was ecstatic. Although this feeling did become bittersweet when he remembered he would have to leave his new friends so many miles from home. All of the forest made a trip to the village to say his goodbyes. While loading up the supplies, the Tolai returned to invite him back to the village for one final farewell feast. After the feast, they invited him to stay with them. They all saw him as one of them, and would have loved for him to remain with them. He considered the offer and figured that he should at least go see his family first. He promised that he would return in 7 years. Moving out to new positions, the Tolai appeared before the company to say one last goodbye to Paul. Paul shouted a tearful goodbye back to them. Shigeru would consider going back to stay with them again, but was convinced by a doctor to at least go see his family. The decision was also helped by the fact that his amputation was at risk of infection, and further operating was necessary. Without further treatment, he would be at risk of death from infection. Finally, a destroyer arrived to the island that would evacuate the rest of the troops that Shigeru was with. Shigeru mentions that no one who has ever been in that situation would ever be capable of understanding their pain, their desire to finally go home. Writing, "It's a physical pain." From the back of the ship, they watched the island of New Britain fade away. And after a week on the open ocean, they could see Mount Fuji. That's when they knew they were really going home. They docked and departed from the vessel in Oraga, Kanagawa Prefecture. He was put in a civilian hospital and his arm operated on, and sent home by train. He had said that he was in the army for 4 years, but it felt like 40. At the station, his father was waiting there to greet him. They walked home together. Once they reached home, the mother of one of the soldiers who had died in Shigeru's company was there. The parents of many of the soldiers who had known Shigeru came by. Eventually, his mother would have to prevent any more parents from coming to see Shigeru. Whenever they did, he would usually only laugh. Not because he was callous or insensitive, but because the sadness he felt was so overwhelming that there was nothing else he could do. That night, his father scrubbed his back, a form of respect in Japanese tradition. The following day, he took a walk around the city, just as he had done 4 years prior before his deployment. Many of the old buildings were gone, but the port was just as he had left it. Out there, he looked at the sky, happy there was nothing to be seen, the bombs, machine gun, and autocannon rounds completely absent. He thought about the immense joy there was to be felt in being alive. This feeling alone kept him content for 2 years after his arrival back home. He would, however, need to find employment to keep his stomach full. A friend he made in the army who had also survived the war suggested buying rice in the northern Tohoku region and selling it for a marked up price in Chiba, a city in the Kanto region near Tokyo. Leaping through the window of a crowded train to go up north, he found his efforts in vain as his wallet disappeared sometime between leaving home and arrival in Tohoku. Lacking any funds to buy a ticket, never mind the rice, he sold his coat and crammed himself back through the window of a crowded train. Another army buddy suggested attending church sermons for the food that would be offered following their conclusion. Finally, Shigeru's older brother returned home. All three of the Mura boys had survived the war. Shigeru would need his arm operated on again. When the time came, medical care had to be administered without an anesthetic, as anesthetics were being rationed by the occupying government. During his recovery in the hospital, he saw an ad for an art school in the paper. So this battered and mutilated war veteran decided that art school would be his best option. He passed the entrance exams. So, while he was still in Japan, Mizuki went to Tarakazuka Family Land, which was an amusement park in Japan that at the time was hosting an event related to Kitaro, promoting Mizuki's work, um, and trying to have an event to drum up more business. But it would be at this event that he met a Sergeant Mia, someone he had met in the South Pacific and had grown close with. And it had been a while since he had seen him. And in fact, he thought he died on the island. But the sergeant revealed to Mizuki that he had disobeyed orders for the suicide charge and made it back with at least one other soldier to Japan. So it would be 6 months later that um, Mizuki's passport arrived, and something that you might notice when reading these books is there's not a great deal of dates mentioned for the things that specifically uh, happen when it's from the point of view of Mizuki. However, he does mention it was November 14th of 1970, which he finally made the return trip to New Britain. Love you. So November 14th of 1970, when he finally made the return trip to New Britain Island. So once they arrived, they spent some time hiking through the jungle, and they ended up coming across the remains, old mess kits, and skeletons, bones of their old comrades who never made it off the island. That night, Mizuki, Mia, and a third soldier who also survived, um, slept under the moon that night. And in that night, all three of them experienced near identical dreams. They all had dreams that the skeletons of their old comrades had risen and were confronting them with the fact that, they are still alive. Why are they still alive while they only had 20 years of life? That's the phrase that's used. Why did you live so long? Only 20 years of life for us. So after awaking, they all decided that it was time to lay them to rest for good. Finally, so they all buried the bones, poured sake over the graves, and offered a offered a prayer, hopefully to console the souls of these uh, these long since gone individuals. And when they did that, a large gathering of